Hey everybody, welcome to the first video tutorial service tutorial, April 2005. My name's Keith. I'm your host for this evening, or this morning, depends when you're downloading your file. Anyways, the first topic that we're going to cover in our tutorial service is posing. We're going to cover posing for a while. And there's a reason why we're going to cover posing for a while, because it's really important. In fact, I'm of the mind that posing is probably the most important thing that you can do in animation. Everything else is gravy. And I've got somebody who can back me up on that. Ham Lusk is one of the 9 old men who's passed on now, but he was one of the 9 old men at Disney. And he has this quote here about animation. He says, "Your animation is only as good as your poses. You can have good timing, good overlapping action, good follow-through, but if your poses are not strong and to the point, meaning telling the story, you don't have good animation." And I believe that's very true. I see a lot of emphasis on polish in CG animation these days. I see a lot of emphasis on making sure that lots of little things are okay and you get the overlaps and stuff, but the things that's lacking is a sense of good posing, understanding what communicates a character. And every image of a pose could be an illustration. It has to be an illustration. It has to read instantly. It has to be something that you get right away. And the thing about posing is that it's the gateway to character. And because it's the gateway to character, that's the gateway to your telling your story. They say that story is king. Story is not necessarily king. It's more like a prince, a crown prince perhaps. But the only reason that story means anything to us is because we care about our characters. If we don't care about our characters, we don't really care what happens to them, therefore the story is meaningless. Let's take a look at this slide right here. There's 2 things that allow you to understand a character, and they are found in the pose. Those 2 elements are appeal and emotion. They come from 2 sides of the same coin. The first part of the pose has to be appealing. Now, appealing doesn't necessarily mean it's fuzzy bunnies with big brown eyes and it looks cute and you go, "Aw." Appeal just means it's something that people can respond to. They're naturally drawn to it. They can look at a character and immediately identify who they are and have the structure within themselves to understand what that character's thinking. Good character design is very important for this. That's why some of the best characters are the simplest ones, because they're easy to read immediately and figure out, hey, I know that person, or I can at least recognize that person, and I can tell the difference between when they're sad and when they're happy. And that's why stuff like Wallace and Gromit is just great. Gromit the dog has absolutely no mouth whatsoever to work with, yet because he's so easily understandable from his appeal, we can understand exactly what he's talking about when he's not even talking. And that appeal is a gateway to understanding their emotion. And that emotion shows who they are as a character. So emotion has to be able to be something that you can draw out of a character so we can understand who they are. So appeal and emotion together are elements of a pose, and the character is in the pose. Buzz holds himself differently than Woody. Shere Khan holds himself differently than Bagheera. Mowgli holds himself differently than Baloo. And it's just a single image can communicate this entire thing. And it's all in the appeal and in communicating the emotion. There's your character. Now you set 2 characters in a place and you have them conflict with each other, and then you've got a story. But you have to care about the characters first. So that's why I don't necessarily think that story is king. I think character is king. If you care about your characters, that means you can understand the posing. Then everything is building up. And that's why the Pixar films are so popular and they're so successful, is because they understand character. And their characters mean a lot to them. And when you take a look at it, their poses mean a lot to them as well. And their stuff is very good because of that. Poses reveal character, and characters drive story. Then the better we are at creating poses that are appealing, that show a character, that give us a window into their soul at that moment as they react to a moment in the story, as they react to yet another character, then the better we are at constructing our poses to allow people to understand and access that character, the better we are at telling stories. And so the specifics now are really important about, okay, what makes up good posing? And so that's what we're going to go to next, is we're going to start delving into the specifics, and we're going to do this for probably a couple months at least, of really figuring out all the little details and all the things to keep in mind for building good, solid posing. Because ultimately, our storytelling is really only as good as our ability to express our characters right at the core issue of it. Those still frame illustrations of who this character is at that moment really capture what the story's about and what that character's about. And so let's move into some specifics as to what makes up good poses. One of the red herrings about CG animation is that it's 3D. Oh, look, it's 3D. It's got dimension. Baloney. If it's up on a screen, which 99.9% of this stuff is, then it's two-dimensional imagery. That's all it is. It may be fancy shading, it may be fancy lighting, it may be a fancy drawing, but ultimately it's just shapes on a two-dimensional plane which are communicating to us the concept of character. And understanding that, we have to look at our poses from a two-dimensional standpoint, more so than you'd think it would be necessary, especially in CG animation. But you have to look at it from that two-dimensional understanding. And because we're looking at things two-dimensionally, as an audience, we have to think about them as animators two-dimensionally. Shapes on screen tell a story. And there's a whole understanding of what makes a shape appealing or a shape communicate. And we have to bring this knowledge back down into our posing and to be able to grasp it and to communicate it. If we don't understand what makes a certain shape aggressive versus another shape being passive, then how in the world are we ever going to communicate that to our audience? We're not going to be able to, and it's just that simple. So it stands to reason that if we're going to start focusing and training our minds to look at our poses and our characters from a two-dimensional aspect, since that's how our audience experiences them, then let's start breaking down what goes into creating good poses from a two-dimensional standpoint. One of the most interesting things about great poses is that great poses, even though they're still, have motion in them. Let's take a look at this right here. I have this little expression, and let's say a guy is saying, "Now look here, you." It's a rather accusing and aggressive move. If you take a look at the picture on the top left, that's rather static and dull, and it just basically stinks. And then you take a look at the one in the lower right, and now there's something happening. Now there's a kind of a force to it. And if we take a look at just analyzing the line of action on these things, we'll see that there is no action on the upper left-hand corner one, and that there is action on the lower right-hand one. And that's the thing we're going to cover a lot in this first one, is the line of action. If we take a look at the line of action here on the upper left-hand one, you'll see it's mostly vertical and horizontal. Nothing much going on there, and it's not very interesting. If we take a look at that, it just lacks direction. The thing about horizontal and vertical lines is they're fairly neutral. They don't have any real meaning to them. Now, they're useful, but in and of themselves, they're fairly neutral. There's not much of a force here. I mean, you could look at it and follow the finger, but you know, if you squint your eyes, you're not really getting much out of it. There's no leading of the viewer's eye, and the pieces of the body are not moving together in order to give us something to drive our eye in a particular area, and there's no cinematic tension whatsoever. Now, if we take a look at the lines of action and how the lines are flowing on the lower right-hand one, we'll see there's a lot more going on. We'll see that there's a definite strong screen right direction to everything that's going on, and it all works together. Everything from the offside hand on the left running up through his shoulders all the way down through the fingertip, from his hips on up into his head. You see there's a very strong angle to it, and so that strong direction is really important, because that is what's going to give all of your poses that sense of motion to them. Even though they're sitting still, the best poses have motion in them, and there's force to it. There's a flow to the image. We're guiding the viewer's eye to the right, and there's a tension inside of this kind of a presentation. So we're going to try and look for these kinds of lines of action, even though they're still images, even though poses aren't really moving yet. We want that sense of motion in them, so that we have that tension, so that we can move our story forward with good storytelling. If we're going to go ahead and define what a line of action is, the way I think of line of action is I'm looking at where the character's force is driving. And so a line of action is the main indicator of, if you were to draw the force through the character from toe to head. Now, there can be multiple lines of action.